Welcome to White People, Black Music, and Liberation. I'm Eric, and I'm here on the journey with you. This is a transmission at the intersection of race, music, and spirituality. It's about moving past the programming and into liberation. Cultural appropriation, am I doing it? It is an age where discernment is ever important. It's also important to realize that on the other end of the stick, around race, a lot of us have been programmed with beliefs around things. And this has created a situation where, for many of us, and I'm speaking of my own experience, there is a tremendous amount of unconsciousness around race. And so we have to be careful when we talk about discernment to not just push away things that may be uncomfortable or pushing on our defensive triggers. Because oftentimes those defensive triggers are the best guidepost for places where we have work to do. So particularly with cultural appropriation, this tends to bring up a lot of defensiveness. The best discussion that I've seen around cultural appropriation is in Shelley Touchlook's book, Living in the Tension. She talks about how, and this is very focused on spiritual communities, and how this deep need for spiritual belonging can lead folks, especially white folks, to adopt practices from marginalized cultures. And we may do this in ways that unintentionally disrespect or strip them of origin. It's important to note that appropriation often happens even among folks with good intentions. One of my favorite elements of Shelley's thinking is very heavily emphasizing both and thinking, how can one simultaneously feel connected and belonging in a spiritual context without it being appropriative. And she also, to be honest, her writing has heavily influenced me. I find this both and thinking to be particularly poignant in the context of the anti-racism discussion, because she often talks about how white folks can build positive identities, so not shame-based or guilt-based identities, but positive identities that also include anti-racism and deprogramming ourselves from the racial biases that we've been given as members of this society. Some of the key questions to ask ourselves are we honoring or co-opting these practices? And are we aware of who these practices belong to? So Shelley doesn't offer us a rigid checklist. She encourages self-inquiry, relationship, and accountability. Questions like, who has historically had access to this practice and who has been punished or marginalized for using it? These are questions that are very, very relevant in the musical context as well. Another good example of this in the spiritual context, if you are engaged with a tradition that has been historically suppressed, especially by your own group, you may be entering appropriation territory. For example, white folks using Native American rituals while Native peoples were criminalized for them just a few generations ago. And there's some obvious parallels there. And of course, consent. Do I have an actual relationship with the community this practice comes from? Am I turning this into something I sell, brand, or profit from? Am I extracting a practice from its cultural, historical, or spiritual context? Even if I mean well, what harm might this be causing? So, having given that brief overview, we can get into this vortex of a debate around what is and what isn't cultural appropriation. And I think that's a waste of time. I think the more relevant question is, am I causing harm? And for me, I'm speaking from my own experience here. I've learned that because of the fact that we live in an unjust society, the simple fact of me playing Black music may harm people. And the reasons for that stem back to a cultural legacy of exploitation that's a big part of the musical tradition of our culture, stemming back to the Lomaxes, stemming back to even the first recordings that were ever made. White musicians playing jazz music, when it's clear that those are all Black musical forms. Just whiteness and a culture that centers whiteness has really drastically shaped how Black music has been received in the world. And, I'll be honest, for years, I avoided the question of appropriation. I'll come back to that in a second. But if you have doubts about the last point that I was making, I would encourage you to check out A History of Rock in 500 Songs. Very beautiful podcast. And a through line through most of the episodes, which involve Black musicians, especially from the anytime in the 1900s. Not to say that it's any better now, but a through line of those stories is exploitation. It is appropriation, and ironically enough, all those things are done while simultaneously the people committing those acts professing to love Black music. So I think that illustrates the very complicated and nuanced relationship between white folks and Black music. There's a push and a pull. We want to take this and we love it, and we're not really going to support you for doing it. So, um, so when I, as a non-Black person, play Black music, it recalls that entire history of exploitation. And if someone feels harmed by that, their feelings are valid. Anger is a very natural response to injustice. And I think that for many years, I avoided this question. And I refused to acknowledge that there was harm that was being created by this. I remember justifications that I used to use, like, Black folks are just too sensitive, or this often happened to me in the context of West African drumming and dancing music, which I studied intensely for a lot of years. And at certain places like the Malanga Center in downtown Oakland, I would feel disapproval from African Americans. And I didn't have a historical context or any inner transformational work to help guide me through understanding where those feelings may have been coming from, so I dismissed them. And I dismissed the impact and the harm that I was causing. And if that whole discussion leaves you with a really vague sense of discomfort, I get that because I lived with that too. But for me, liberation really began with acknowledging that harm. Really, honestly. I had to look at that harm in the face and accept that it exists and accept that I'm creating that harm. Because really, unless I acknowledge that harm, I can't ask the question, what am I going to do to repair it? So coming back to the cultural appropriation piece, the purpose of this isn't to give you a guidebook for whether you're doing it or not. The purpose of this is to ask the question, first of all, am I causing harm? And really honestly answer that. And to not be afraid of saying yes to that question. Because that's only really the first part of the conversation. The conversation can only really begin with that acknowledgement. And then the more important piece of it is, what am I going to do to repair? What am I going to do to give back? What am I going to do to make this situation better? Not just for me, but for my children and for the world in general. And once I got past myself a little bit in being sucked up in feeling bad or feeling some kind of way for the harm, the liberation kicked through. Because really, as white, or in my case, white passing folks who love Black music, we should be on the front lines for justice in this world. A world where this sort of exploitation doesn't happen anymore. A world where everybody has an equal shot at liberation. The liberation that's relatively more accessible to some of us should be available to everyone. With that, I'm wishing everyone a wonderful day, night, and I'm sending you my blessings. See you next time. I'm Eric, and this has been White People, Black Music, and Liberation. If this message speaks to you and you want to be part of the journey, head to whitepeopleblackmusic.com and let's build a world where liberation is for everyone.